I moved to the high Cascades in 1962 to escape a world that never stopped shouting. Being deaf since birth, I thought the absolute silence of the deep timber would be my sanctuary. But I wasn't alone. A massive figure was watching me from the tree line, fascinated by the fact that I didn't flinch when he crushed the dry brush behind me. Over the next 30 years, we didn't just coexist. We built a language entirely of our own. He taught me that you don't need to hear to understand the secrets of the forest. You just need to know how to look. If you enjoy true stories about the unexplained mysteries of the wild, please hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next video. Now, let me tell you the story of the 48 journals I left behind. I moved to the high Cascades in the spring of 1962, a 45-year-old refugee from a world that never stopped shouting. I had spent my entire life watching mouths move, trying to decipher the rapid-fire code of lips and tongues, exhausted by the effort of pretending to understand. The hearing world is a place of constant anxiety for a man born into silence, a relentless series of missed cues and awkward apologies. I bought the cabin on 30 acres of dense fir not to find myself, but to lose the burden of being the deaf man in a town of hearing people. Up here, the trees didn't expect me to listen, and the wind didn't demand a response. The cabin was a rough-hewn structure at the end of a logging road that had been reclaimed by salal and blackberry bushes. It was perfect in its isolation, a fortress of solitude where the only vibrations were the ones I made myself. For the first time in decades, I stopped wearing my hearing aids, those buzzing, static-filled devices that only amplified the chaos. I locked them in a drawer on my first night, choosing the pure, absolute silence of my natural state over the distorted noise of technology. The relief was physical, a loosening of a knot in my chest that I hadn't realized was there. People assume that deafness is a lack, a void where sound should be, but in the deep woods, it became a superpower of heightened perception. I learned to read the forest through the soles of my boots, feeling the heavy thud of an elk's gait long before a hearing man would hear the twig snap. I saw the way the air currents shifted the upper branches of the pines, predicting the weather by the dance of the needles. My peripheral vision expanded, catching the flicker of a squirrel or the shadow of a hawk with a predator's sharpness. Silence wasn't empty. It was full of information that the noisy world ignored. I spent my days working the land, repairing the rot in the porch and clearing the overgrown trails with a machete. The physical labor was a meditation, the vibration of the axe hitting the wood traveling up my arms and centering me in the moment. I didn't need to hear the chop. I felt the resistance and the release, a tactile rhythm that replaced the auditory one. I began to keep a journal, filling pages with sketches of the flora and fauna, documenting the way light hit the valley floor at noon. It was a life of visual richness, a technicolor existence where I was finally the primary observer. Safety was a concern, of course. I knew that I wouldn't hear a bear crashing through the brush or a cougar stalking me from behind. I developed a habit of constant scanning, my head on a swivel, checking my 6 o'clock every few minutes. I learned to watch the jays and the squirrels. If they suddenly scattered or went still, I knew something large was moving nearby. The forest had its own visual alarm system if you knew how to look for it, a ripple of panic that spread through the undergrowth ahead of a predator. I was vulnerable, yes, but I was also more attuned to the environment than I had ever been in the city. The nights were the most profound, a darkness so deep that it felt velvety against my skin, undisturbed by the mechanical hum of civilization. I would sit on my porch with a kerosene lamp, watching the moths batter themselves against the glass, feeling the cool draft from the creek. I wasn't lonely. For the first time, I felt entirely integrated into my surroundings. In the city, silence is a barrier between people. In the woods, silence is the natural state of the universe. I was no longer broken. I was simply another quiet creature in a quiet world. As summer deepened, I began to sense a change in the atmosphere of the property, a subtle shift that prickled the hairs on my arms. It wasn't something I saw directly, but rather a feeling of displacement, as if the air in the clearing was being occupied by something massive. I would find rocks moved from where I had left them, or branches snapped at a height that no deer could reach. I dismissed it at first as the work of a bear, perhaps a large male claiming territory, but the signs were too deliberate, too careful. I started finding arrangements of pine cones on my chopping block, stacked in neat pyramids that defied the randomness of nature. I would wake up to find the woodpile restacked, not by me, but with a precision that suggested hands, not paws. I would stand in the clearing, feeling the vibration of heavy footsteps in the ground. Thump, 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 a rhythm too heavy for a man and too bipedal for a bear. I knew I was being watched, but unlike the staring eyes in the city, this scrutiny didn't feel judgmental. It felt curious. I spent hours sketching on the porch, trying to capture the feeling of the forest, but my eyes kept darting to the tree line. The density of the foliage seemed to shift, shadows detaching themselves from trunks and then merging back before I could focus. I wasn't afraid, strangely. I felt a kinship with whatever was out there, another solitary being existing in the quiet. I didn't know then that my deafness, my inability to hear the warnings or the roars, was the very thing that made me approachable. One afternoon in late July, the heat was shimmering off the meadow grass, distorting the air into waves of liquid glass. I was engrossed in drawing a detail of a fern, my world narrowed down to the tip of my charcoal pencil. I felt a vibration, a deep, resonant tremor in the floorboards of the porch that was distinct from the wind. It was the sensation of weight being shifted, of something immense settling into a standing position just beyond the railing. I looked up, expecting to see a deer, or maybe the UPS driver lost on the fire road, but the figure standing at the edge of the clearing was neither. I looked up from my sketchbook, my eyes adjusting from the white paper to the vibrant green of the forest edge, and there he was. He didn't burst from the cover or make a grand entrance. He simply stepped out from behind a massive cedar as if he had been part of the bark a moment before. He stood about 80 feet away, at the exact boundary where my manicured yard met the wild tangle of the woods. He was massive, easily 7 feet tall, covered in a coat of reddish-brown hair that caught the afternoon sun like copper wire. He wasn't a blurry shape or a fleeting shadow. He was a solid, three-dimensional fact standing in my flower bed. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic vibration I could feel in my throat. But I remained glued to my chair. Instinct told me to run, to scramble inside and lock the door, but a deeper curiosity anchored me in place. I had spent my life missing the audio cues that warn of danger, the growls, the snapping twigs, so I had learned to trust my eyes above all else. And my eyes were telling me that this creature wasn't aggressive. He wasn't posturing or baring teeth. He was standing with a relaxed, almost slouching posture, his long arms hanging loosely by his knees. He was simply watching me. I realized with a jolt that he must have made noise approaching. A creature of that size crushing dry brush would have sounded like a bulldozer to a hearing man. Any normal person would have spun around, startled by the sound, heart rate spiking in a panic reaction. But I hadn't moved. I had continued to sketch, oblivious to the auditory warning, until he was standing in plain sight. He seemed to be processing this anomaly, his head cocked to the side, analyzing why the small human hadn't flinched at his approach. It was the first moment of understanding between us. He knew I was different. He took a step forward, and I felt the vibration of his footfall rattle the teacup on the railing next to me. It was a heavy, deliberate stomp, a test of the environment. He watched my face intently, looking for the reaction to the sound he had just made. When I didn't turn my head or cover my ears, but instead stared fixedly at his feet and then his eyes, his expression shifted. The tension in his shoulders dropped. He seemed to understand that the air between us carried no signal for me, that I was insulated from the intimidation of noise. I looked at his face, fascinated by the humanity etched into the savage features. His skin was dark, almost black, with deep fissures around his eyes and mouth that suggested age and exposure. His nose was broad and flat, flaring as he scented the air, smelling the charcoal and the coffee. But his eyes were the focal point, amber, deep-set, and incredibly intelligent. They weren't the blank eyes of a deer or the predatory eyes of a cougar. They were the eyes of an anthropologist discovering a new tribe. He was studying me with the same intensity that I was studying him. I slowly raised my hand, moving with the fluid caution I used when sketching birds, and touched my chest. It was a reflexive gesture, a sign of me or self, a way to acknowledge my own presence in the face of this giant. He tracked the movement, his eyes locking onto my hand. He didn't recoil. He watched my fingers spread against my shirt, analyzing the gesture as a form of communication rather than a threat. It occurred to me that he might be used to humans waving guns or screaming. Silence and sign were likely a novelty to him. We stayed frozen like that for what felt like an hour, though the shadows on the porch barely moved. The wind ruffled his fur, and I could see the muscles rippling underneath, a dormant power that could destroy my cabin in seconds. Yet he stayed on his side of the clearing, respecting an invisible boundary line. I sensed that he was waiting for me to do something, to prove that I was the anomaly he suspected I was. He was testing the hypothesis that I was a creature of sight, just like him in that moment. I picked up my charcoal stick and turned a fresh page in the journal, my movements deliberate and slow. I didn't look down. I kept my eyes on him, sketching blindly, capturing the line of his shoulder and the shape of his head. He watched the motion of my hand, his gaze shifting from my face to the pad. He seemed to understand that I was recording him, creating a visual echo of his presence. He shifted his weight, turning slightly to give me a profile view, a pose that felt intentional. He was modeling. He was participating in the documentation. The interaction was broken not by a sound, but by the light. The sun dipped below the tree line, casting long shadows that stretched across the yard, touching his feet. He looked up at the sky, then back at me, and let out a puff of breath that I saw as a white cloud in the cooling air. He tapped his own chest, a mimicry of my earlier gesture, with a massive, dark hand. It was clumsy, a rough approximation, but the intent was clear. He was acknowledging the sign. He was answering me. Then he turned and walked back into the forest. He didn't run. He moved with a smooth, silent gait, stepping high over the ferns. He paused at the tree line, looking back over his shoulder to ensure I was still watching. I raised my hand in a simple, open-palmed wave. He didn't wave back, but he held my gaze for a second longer before vanishing into the shadows. I was left alone on the porch, the vibration of his steps fading from the floorboards, realizing that my deafness hadn't isolated me from the wild. It had just given me the qualifications to enter it. The autumn of 1962 transformed my porch from a place of leisure into a classroom, with the forest edge serving as the blackboard. He returned 3 days after the first encounter, standing in the exact same spot, waiting for me to pick up my journal. The fear I should have felt was completely eclipsed by the thrill of communication. For a deaf man, the world is often a series of locked doors, but he was handing me a key. He seemed to understand that our connection relied entirely on line of sight, so he always positioned himself where the sunlight hit his upper body, illuminating his hands. He wasn't just visiting, he was working, engaging in a deliberate effort to bridge the gap between our species. The lessons began with nouns, the building blocks of our shared reality. He would point a massive dark finger at a specific object, a towering Douglas fir, for example, and wait until my eyes followed the line. Once he was sure I was looking at the tree, he would bring his hands back to his chest and make a shape. He would press his forearms together, then splay his fingers wide at the top, mimicking the trunk and the canopy. It was a visual onomatopoeia, a physical shape that captured the essence of tree more perfectly than the spoken word ever could. I would mimic the sign back to him, my pale, slender hands looking ridiculous compared to his baseball mitt paws. If I got the angle of the branches wrong, or if I moved too fast, he would stop me. He would shake his head, a universally understood negative, and repeat the motion, slower and with more emphasis. He was a strict teacher, demanding precision. He understood that if we were going to build a language, the foundation had to be solid. When I finally mirrored the sign correctly, he would give a single, sharp nod, his way of saying good, and then move on to the next object. We moved from trees to rocks, to the creek, to the deer that sometimes grazed in the meadow. I tried at first to use standard American Sign Language, ASL, flashing the sign for water or stone, but he stared at me blankly. ASL was a human construct, abstract and arbitrary. He had no context for an alphabet he couldn't see or hear. I realized quickly that I had to abandon my language and learn his. His signs were rooted in the physical world, in the shape and movement of the things they represented. Water wasn't a letter W tapped on the chin. It was a fluid, rolling motion of the hand that mimicked the flow of the creek. As the weeks turned into months, the vocabulary expanded from objects to concepts. He taught me the sign for listen or pay attention, which wasn't pointing to the ear, but a flat hand held motionless in the air, fingers spread to feel vibration. It was a revelation to me. His concept of listening was tactile, just like mine. He taught me danger, a sharp, jagged motion across the chest that mimicked a slash or a break. He was giving me the tools to survive in his world, equipping me with the warnings I couldn't hear. The winter of 1963 tested our dedication, burying the valley in 5 feet of snow, but the lessons didn't stop. He would arrive against a backdrop of blinding white, his dark fur standing out in high contrast, making his hand signals even easier to read. I would sit on the porch wrapped in blankets, sketching the signs furiously, terrified I would forget them. He seemed immune to the cold, standing still for an hour at a time, his breath steaming in rhythmic clouds. The dedication he showed was humbling. He was trudging through deep drifts just to teach a deaf man how to say, snow. I began to experiment, combining signs to create sentences, testing the limits of his comprehension. I would sign deer plus water, pointing to the creek, asking if the animals were drinking. He would watch my clumsy attempts, his head tilted, processing the syntax. When he understood, the amber light in his eyes would flare, and he would respond with a complex string of gestures that added detail. Deer, water, morning, many. He was teaching me tense and quantity, expanding the grammar of the forest. There were moments of frustration, usually on my part, when my human brain couldn't grasp the nuance of his movement. Once he kept repeating a gesture that looked like a spiraling motion, pointing at the sky. I thought he meant bird or wind, But he kept shaking his head, his movements getting sharper and more agitated. Finally, he picked up a dead leaf and let it fall, spinning, to the ground. Fall, or perhaps cycle. He was trying to explain the season, the passage of time. When I finally signed it back, the tension drained from his shoulders, and he sat down in the snow, exhausted by the effort of translation. I realized during these sessions that I had never felt more connected to another being in my life. In the human world, I was disabled, broken, a man who required accommodation. In his world, on the edge of that clearing, I was simply a student. He didn't care that my ears didn't work. He cared that my eyes did. He valued my attention, my patience, and my willingness to learn. For the first time, my silence wasn't a wall separating me from others. It was the very thing that allowed me to hear him. By the spring of 1963, we had a working vocabulary of over 50 distinct signs. We could discuss the weather, the movement of the herds, and the safety of the perimeter. But as the snow melted and the days grew longer, I sensed a shift in his curriculum. He stopped pointing at rocks and trees and started pointing at himself, and then at the horizon. The signs became more abstract, more urgent. He wasn't just teaching me nouns anymore. He was preparing to tell me a story, building the scaffold for a conversation that he had been waiting years to have. The summer of 1964 brought a heat that baked the pine needles into a fragrant crisp, the air shimmering with a density that distorted the horizon. Our sessions had become a daily ritual, a comfortable routine of nouns and simple verbs that felt like a quiet conversation between neighbors. But on a Tuesday in late August, the atmosphere shifted violently. He didn't arrive with his usual calm, loping stride. He appeared at the edge of the clearing with a sudden, rigid intensity that vibrated through the ground. He stood closer than he ever had before, breaking the 80-foot rule, encroaching until he was looming just 40 feet from my porch railing. His appearance was disheveled, his fur bristling with static energy, bits of bramble caught in the hair on his arms as if he had run through the brush. He didn't wait for me to pick up my charcoal or my journal. He began signing immediately, his movements sharp and emphatic. He made the sign for listen, that flat hand held in the air. But he held it there with a trembling tension, demanding absolute focus. This wasn't a lesson about a deer or a storm. This was a monologue, a desperate attempt to convey a complex thought before the window of opportunity closed. He started by pointing at himself, tapping his massive chest with a force that I could almost feel, then pointing directly at me. Me. You. He repeated it 3 times, establishing the subjects of the sentence, locking our identities together in the space between us. Then he made a new gesture, one I hadn't seen before. He touched 2 fingers to his own eyes, then brought them down to touch his heart. See? Feel. It wasn't just physical sight, it was internal perception. He pointed at me again, repeating the motion. He was asking, no, demanding, that I not just watch him, but truly understand him. The speed of his gestures increased, his hands blurring in the afternoon light, moving with a fluidity that was mesmerizing and overwhelming. He pointed to the trees, the rocks, the sky, and the dirt, his hands flying through the nouns we had established over 2 years. But he wasn't just listing them, he was linking them. He would sign tree, then clasp his hands together. He would sign water, then clasp his hands together. He was building a web in the air, a visual representation of connection that tied every element of the landscape into a singular knotted whole. I scrambled to keep up, my own hands twitching as I tried to mirror him, to show I was following, but he shook his head violently. No. Watch. He didn't want me to mimic. He wanted me to witness. He swept his arm across the entire horizon, encompassing the valley, the peaks, and the hidden places I had never seen. Then he brought his hands back to his chest, pressing them flat against his fur, and then extended them toward me, palms up. The land. Us. Same. He was trying to explain a philosophy of existence, a concept of oneness that my segmented human brain was struggling to process. His expression was agonizing to behold, a mix of fierce determination and a deep, sorrowful frustration. He knew the limitations of my understanding. He knew he was trying to pour the ocean into a thimble. He made a sign that looked like breaking a stick, then pointed to the logging road in the distance. Break. Bad. Then he pointed to the 2 of us and clasped his hands again. Together. Whole. He was warning me about the fracture of the world, about the separation that my kind brought to his, and pleading with me to remain part of the whole. He made a gesture that I interpreted as time, a slow, arcing motion of the hand tracking the sun across the sky. But he repeated it over and over, speeding it up until it was a blur. Many suns. Many years. He pointed to the ground, then to himself, implying an ancient tenure. Then he pointed to me and made a small, short gesture. brief. He was contextualizing our lives, showing me the blink of my existence against the endurance of his people. It was a lesson in humility delivered by a giant who had watched civilizations rise and fall from the tree line. The climax of the encounter came when he stopped moving his arms and simply stared at me, his chest heaving with exertion. He looked at me with a vulnerability that stripped me bare, his amber eyes searching for a spark of comprehension in mine. He raised one hand and traced the shape of his own face in the air, then traced the shape of mine. He brought his hands together, weaving his fingers into a tight, unbreakable lock. Brother. Same. It was a declaration of kinship that ignored biology, a statement that we were both spirits trapped in different forms, bound to the same dying wilderness. I sat there, tears streaming down my face, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was trying to say. I didn't have the signs to reply. My vocabulary was too small, too concrete for the poetry he was performing. I simply placed my hand over my heart and held it there, a universal sign of receipt. I felt the vibration of his heavy footfall as he stomped the ground once, an exclamation point. He had said his piece. He had delivered the sermon of the forest to the only congregation he could find. He turned and walked away, but his departure was different this time. He moved slowly, his shoulders slumped with the exhaustion of the effort. He didn't look back. He vanished into the shadows, leaving me on the porch with a notebook full of frantic scribbles and a soul that felt expanded and bruised. I spent the rest of the evening staring at the trees, realizing that he hadn't just been teaching me a language. He had been trying to download a consciousness, and I was terrified that I had missed the most important part of the message. The weeks following that intense sermon on the porch were a blur of charcoal dust and sleepless nights, a fever dream of attempted translation. I treated my journal not as a diary but as the Rosetta Stone, dissecting every sketch and memory with the obsession of a cryptographer trying to break an enemy code. I broke down his fluid movements into static frames, analyzing the angle of a wrist or the speed of a finger curl, convinced that a literal message was hidden in the geometry. I filled page after page with theories, linking his signs to Navajo hand talk, to ASL, even to the gestural theories of early hominids. I was desperate to turn his poetry into prose, to force his wild, ancient concepts into the rigid boxes of the English language. But the more I analyzed, the further the meaning seemed to slip away, like trying to hold water in a clenched fist. I would look at a drawing of his hand clasping mine, the sign for brother or same, and feel a hollow ache of inadequacy. On paper, it was just ink. In the air, it had been a transfer of soul. I realized that my obsession with definition was a human flaw, a need to categorize and label the unknown to make it safe. I was trying to reduce a being of immense spiritual complexity into a dictionary entry, and in doing so, I was missing the music for the notes. The creature continued to visit during this period, but his demeanor had changed. The urgency of the summer was gone, replaced by a patient, watchful stillness. He would stand at the tree line, arms crossed, watching me frantically scribble in my notebook, his expression one of mild pity. He knew I was struggling. He knew I was trying to build a bridge out of paper when he had already walked across the water. He didn't offer more signs. He had given me the curriculum, and now he was waiting for me to graduate from the need for words. Autumn arrived with a vengeance, stripping the maples of their leaves and turning the valley into a skeleton of gray trunks and brown earth. The visual noise of the forest increased, the falling leaves creating a chaotic background that made sign language difficult to read. I found myself squinting, frustrated, trying to filter the signal from the static. I would sign questions to him: why, when, who, demanding clarity, demanding answers to the mysteries of his existence. He would simply look at me, blink slowly, and remain motionless, refusing to engage in my interrogation. It hit me on a cold Tuesday in November, a revelation that arrived not with a bang, but with the quiet settling of the first snow. I was sitting on the porch, shivering, looking at a drawing of his eyes I had made months ago. I realized suddenly that I wasn't failing to understand him because of a language barrier. I was failing because of a species barrier. His mind didn't work in linear sentences. He didn't think in subjects and objects. He thought in holistic webs of connection, in emotions that were physical realities. I was trying to translate a thunderstorm into binary code. The realization was humbling, a crushing blow to my ego as a man who prided himself on his perception. I had to accept that there were parts of his experience that I could never comprehend. I would never know what it felt like to hear the infrasound of the earth, or to remember the ice age in my genetic memory. I would never understand the true depth of the sign for forest, because to him, the forest wasn't a place, it was an extension of his own body. We were two different biological systems running different operating software, and perfect compatibility was a myth. I closed the journal that afternoon and laid the charcoal down on the railing, a gesture of surrender. I looked out at the clearing where he usually stood, empty now in the early twilight, and felt a profound sense of relief wash over me. I didn't need to solve him. I didn't need to write the dictionary of the Sasquatch. The connection we had shared wasn't about the transfer of data. It was about the sharing of presence. The fact that he stood there and I sat here, and we didn't kill each other, that was the message. That was the miracle. When he appeared the next day, I didn't pick up the notebook. I didn't raise my hands to sign a question. I just sat there, wrapped in my blanket, holding a cup of coffee, and looked at him. I met his gaze and held it, projecting a sense of calm acceptance, letting go of the frantic need to know. "I see you," my eyes said. "I don't understand you, but I see you." He stood there for a long moment, processing the change in my energy, sensing that the manic student had finally left the building. He let out a long, visible breath, his shoulders dropping an inch, the tension leaving his massive frame. He stepped out from the protection of the tree, breaking his own cover, and walked closer than he had in weeks. He sat down on a large stump near the edge of the yard, mirroring my posture. We sat there for an hour, two old men, one human, one myth, watching the snow fall in absolute comfortable silence. There were no signs, no gestures, no attempts to bridge the gap. We just let the gap exist, and found that we could sit on opposite sides of it and still be together. As the winter deepened, burying the cabin in silence and ice, our relationship entered a new phase. The frantic lessons of the summer were over, replaced by a quiet, enduring companionship that required no translation. I burned the failed translation notes in the wood stove, watching the smoke rise up the chimney, sending my confusion back into the atmosphere. I was ready for the long haul, for the years of quiet witness that lay ahead. I had stopped trying to read his mind and started learning how to just be with his spirit. The years bled into one another after the winter of '65, losing their sharp edges as the urgency of our communication faded into a comfortable, worn-in routine. The frantic need to define our relationship evaporated, replaced by the simple, undeniable fact of it. He visited my porch 3 or 4 times a week, arriving with the casual regularity of a neighbor stopping by for coffee. There were no more frantic hand signals, no more charcoal sketches, no more desperate attempts to bridge the species gap with nouns and verbs. We had graduated past the need for language, entering a phase of companionship that was defined entirely by presence. He would arrive in the late afternoon, usually when the sun was dipping behind the ridge, casting the valley in a long golden light. He would step out of the tree line and walk directly to the porch, no longer hesitating at the boundary of the yard. He would sit down on the heavy timber steps, his back resting against the railing, his massive legs stretched out into the grass. I would bring out my chair and sit a few feet away, close enough to feel the radiant heat of his body and smell the musk of the forest that clung to him. We were 2 old bachelors watching the world turn, united by the silence that the rest of the world feared. Our primary activity was simply witnessing. We watched the seasons change the color of the valley, tracking the green of spring as it climbed the mountain and the gold of autumn as it descended. We watched the creek rise with the meltwater and shrink in the August heat. He had an infinite capacity for stillness, sitting for hours without shifting his weight, his amber eyes tracking the flight of a hawk or the movement of a beetle. I learned to slow my own internal clock to match his, finding a peace in the observation that I had never known in the frantic pace of the city. There was a profound intimacy in that shared silence, a connection that went deeper than any conversation I'd ever had with a hearing person. When you remove the pressure to speak, to perform, to explain, you are left with the raw essence of being. I didn't need to tell him I was tired. He saw it in the slump of my shoulders. He didn't need to tell me he was hungry. I saw it in the way he eyed the orchard. We existed in a state of mutual transparency, reading each other's physical cues with the fluency of old friends who finish each other's sentences. He brought small things to show me, not as lessons, but as shared curiosities. A piece of quartz with a vein of gold, a shed antler from a massive elk, a bird's nest blown down in a storm. He would place them on the railing between us, handling them with delicate reverence. I would examine them, nod my appreciation, and hand them back. It was a ritual of appreciation, a way of saying, "Look at this beautiful thing we found in our home." It wasn't science, it was art appreciation, conducted by a giant and a deaf man on a rotting porch. The physical distance between us shrank until it was non-existent. There were days when he would sit so close that his fur brushed against my arm when he shifted. I stopped flinching at his size, stopped calculating the damage he could do. I realized that his power was entirely under his control, a dormant force that he chose not to use. He was gentle with me, perhaps sensing my fragility as I aged, moving with exaggerated care when he was within my personal space. He treated me not like a pet, but like a smaller, breakable equal. We watched the world change from our vantage point, seeing the contrails of jets multiply in the sky above us. I would point to them, making a face of distaste, and he would let out a low, rumbling huff of agreement. We were co-conspirators against the modern age, two holdouts in a pocket of time that was rapidly shrinking. We ignored the distant whine of logging trucks and the creep of civilization, pretending that the boundaries of our world stopped at the tree line. As long as he was on the porch, the illusion held. I remember one evening in particular, during a meteor shower in late August. We sat side by side, heads tipped back, watching the streaks of light burn up in the atmosphere. Every time a particularly bright one flared, he would tap his chest, a silent acknowledgement of the spectacle. We sat there until dawn, freezing and stiff, unwilling to break the connection with the cosmos or with each other. It remains one of the holiest nights of my life, a silent mass celebrated under the open sky. My own body began to betray me as the 70s wore on, the arthritis in my hands making it harder to sketch, my knees complaining on the steep trails. He noticed. He began to modify his behavior to accommodate me, slowing his walk when I accompanied him to the creek, waiting patiently while I navigated the rocks. He would offer me a hand to steady myself, his grip firm and supportive. It was a role reversal that touched me deeply. The wild beast was becoming the caretaker of the civilized man. But as 1979 approached, I began to notice that the toll of time wasn't exclusive to me. The invincible giant was showing cracks in the armor. He took longer to stand up from the steps, groaning with a vibration I could feel in the floorboards. He slept more, his head nodding onto his chest as we sat in the sun, and when the light hit him just right, I could see the silver creeping into the reddish-brown fur of his muzzle and shoulders. We were fading together, two leaves turning brown on the same branch, and I knew with a heavy heart that the winter of our lives was coming. By 1979, the calendar on my wall said I was 62, but my joints argued I was much older. The steep hike to the creek, once a morning warm-up, had become a half-day expedition, requiring a walking stick and frequent rests. I spent more time in the rocking chair than I did clearing brush, watching the perimeter of my world shrink to the distance I could comfortably walk. I wasn't the vibrant, capable man who had carved a life out of the wilderness anymore. I was a caretaker of my own decline. And as I looked out at the edge of the clearing, I saw that the mirror held up by the forest was reflecting the same hard truth. He arrived later in the evenings now, often waiting until the cool blue of twilight to make his appearance, avoiding the harsh heat of the midday sun. The silver that had started on his muzzle years ago had spread like a slow-moving frost, coating his shoulders and chest in a distinguished, dusty gray. His coat, once thick and lustrous as a bear's, looked thinner in patches, revealing the scars of a life lived without medicine or shelter. He moved with a hitch in his right hip, a stiffness that mimicked my own arthritis, turning his fluid glide into a heavy, laborious trudge. The king of the forest was limping, and it broke my heart to see it. The porch steps, which he used to mount in a single easy motion, became an obstacle we both respected. I watched him approach them with a new hesitation, gripping the railing to haul his massive bulk up to the deck level. The wood groaned under the strain, a vibration I felt in my feet, signaling the effort it cost him just to come sit with me. He would settle down with a heavy, exhaling sigh that shook his whole frame, closing his eyes for a moment to let the pain settle. We were two old soldiers meeting at the Veterans Hall, worn down by the long war against gravity and time. Our interactions became less about observation and more about mutual comfort. He stopped bringing me rocks and feathers. The energy required to forage for treasures was better spent conserving heat. Instead, we shared the simple luxury of rest. I would bring out a heavy wool blanket and drape it over my legs, and though he never used one, he would lean closer to the radiant heat of the cabin wall. We sat shoulder to shoulder, the heat of his body warming my side, a biological furnace that was banking its fires for the coming night. I noticed the clouding in his amber eyes, the milky haze of cataracts beginning to dull the fierce intelligence that had captivated me for decades. He scanned the tree line less frequently, his vigilance softening into a dreamy, half-lidded stare. He wasn't watching for threats anymore. He seemed to be watching his memories, or perhaps just drifting in the safe harbor of the clearing. It terrified me to think that his senses were failing, that the sharp hearing and sight that had kept him alive were betraying him. A deaf man knows the danger of a silent world, but for a wild creature, it is a death sentence. The silence between us changed quality. It wasn't the pregnant, communicative silence of our teaching days, nor the companionable silence of the middle years. It was a heavy twilight silence, the kind that hangs in a room where someone is waiting for the end. I found myself studying him with a desperate intensity, memorizing the curve of his ear, the texture of his hands, trying to archive him before he vanished. I sketched him constantly, my hands shaking, trying to capture the dignity of his aging face, the noble weariness that had replaced the raw power. We became barometers for each other, sensing the incoming weather through the ache in our bones. On days when the low-pressure systems rolled in from the coast, we were both grumpy and stiff, moving with careful, pained slowness. On the rare warm days of Indian summer, we would both perk up, lifting our faces to the sun like lizards, soaking in the energy. It was a symbiotic decline, a shared navigation of the inevitable that made the process less lonely. I wasn't just aging, I was fading in tandem with a legend. There was a day in late autumn when he stumbled in the yard, his foot catching on a root he would have easily stepped over 10 years ago. He went down on one knee, catching himself with a heavy thud that vibrated the ground. He stayed there for a long time, head bowed, breathing hard. I started to stand up, to go to him, but something in his posture stopped me. He held up a hand, a sharp, stop gesture. He needed to recover his dignity on his own. He stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from his knee, and walked to the porch without looking at me. We never acknowledged it, but we both knew the clock was ticking louder. I began to dread the winters with a new, sharp anxiety, terrified that the cold would be the thing that finally broke the cycle. Every time he walked back into the woods in November, disappearing into the snow, I wondered if it was the last time I would see him. I would wait by the window for days, scanning the white landscape for his dark shape, my heart in my throat. When he finally reappeared, gaunt and tired but alive, the relief was so intense it made me dizzy. We were playing a game of Russian roulette with the seasons, and the odds were getting worse every year. Acceptance is a slow poison, but eventually you drink it. I realized that our time was finite, a limited resource that we had spent lavishly for 20 years. There would be no miracle rejuvenation, no return to the glory days of the summer of '64. We were in the final chapter, the epilogue of a story that no one else would ever read. I stopped mourning the loss of his strength and started cherishing the fragility of his presence. Every visit was a victory. Every sunset we watched together was a stolen gem. We sat on the porch as the decade turned, two old ghosts haunting the same hillside, waiting for the light to fade. The calendar on the wall reads 1992, and the face in the mirror is a landscape of wrinkles that maps 85 years of survival. The silence that used to be my sanctuary has changed texture. It's no longer the pregnant, expectant silence of a waiting room, but the hollow, dusty silence of a museum after closing time. He hasn't come to the porch in over 2 years. I mark the days on the calendar, watching the seasons cycle through without him, knowing in my gut that the heavy step will never vibrate these floorboards again. The king is gone, claimed by the winter or the earth, leaving me as the last living speaker of a language of two. I still leave the apples on the railing every evening, a ritual that has transitioned from hospitality to ceremony. I watch the raccoons and the deer eat them, grateful that something is being fed, but the emptiness of the gesture aches in my hands. It is a signal fire kept burning for a ghost, a stubborn refusal to admit that the story has ended. I sit in my chair, wrapped in blankets against the deep chill of age, watching the tree line with eyes that are failing, hoping for one last shadow to detach itself from the dark. But the woods are just woods now, static and empty, stripped of the magic that made them alive. Inside the cabin, stacked in the heavy oak chest at the foot of my bed, are 48 leather-bound journals. They contain the sum total of my life's work. Thousands of charcoal sketches, diagrams of hand signs, and frantic, scribbled theories about the nature of his intelligence. The smell of them, old paper, graphite, and time, is the scent of my soul. They are the only physical proof that any of this happened, that a deaf man and a giant bridged the evolutionary gap on a porch in the Cascades. Without them, I am just a crazy old hermit who hallucinated a friend out of loneliness. I have spent many nights debating what to do with them, holding a match over the open pages, wondering if fire is the only way to keep the secret safe. If I publish them, if I hand them over to the hearing world with their microphones and their cameras, they will descend on this valley like locusts. They will hunt for bones, they will cast tracks, they will dissect the mystery until it is dead on a lab table. They wouldn't understand the silence. They would look for data points in biology, missing the spiritual connection that was the true core of our contact. I look at the sketches of his hands, the way I tried to capture the nuance of a finger curl or the angle of a wrist, and I smile at my own arrogance. I spent decades trying to build a dictionary, trying to force his vast, holistic consciousness into the narrow boxes of human language. I thought I was failing because I couldn't find the right signs, but I see now that the failure was the point. The gap between us wasn't meant to be crossed with grammar, it was meant to be crossed with empathy. The fact that we sat together, two different species with no common words, and felt safe, that was the language. The journals are not a scientific record. They are a testament to the limits of understanding. They document the beautiful, tragic reality that we can never truly know another being, yet we can love them anyway. I realized that the knowledge I gained from him was never meant for the textbooks. It was a private gift, a transmission of wisdom that was meant to change me, not the world. He didn't come to the porch to be studied. He came to be seen. He came because in a world of noise and danger, I offered him the one thing he couldn't find anywhere else, a quiet place to rest. I have decided to leave the journals here, hidden beneath the floorboards where the vibration of his footsteps used to resonate. I will not burn them, but I will not broadcast them. I am leaving them for the next person who finds this cabin, the next seeker who comes here looking for silence. If they have the eyes to see and the patience to listen to the quiet, they will find the truth. If they are just looking for real estate or timber, the journals will remain sleeping in the dark, protecting the history of the valley. My own time is drawing short. I can feel the rhythm of my heart slowing, syncing up with the long, slow cycles of the mountain. I am not afraid of the end. I have lived a life of profound wonder, witnessing things that no other human has seen. I have looked into the eyes of the ancient world and seen recognition there. When I close my eyes for the last time, I won't be entering a void. I will be entering the ultimate silence, the one he tried to explain to me all those years ago with his sweeping gestures at the sky. I spend my final days sitting on the porch, not sketching, not working, just being. I watch the light fade on the peaks, turning the snow to lavender and gold, and I feel a profound sense of peace. The woods are empty, yes, but they are also full of memory. Every tree, every rock, every shadow holds a piece of our conversation. I am not alone here. I am surrounded by the echo of a friendship that defied the laws of nature. So I wait. I wait for the sun to go down, for the stars to wheel overhead, and for the final darkness to come. And in the quiet of my own mind, I still talk to him. I sign into the empty air, my gnarled hands moving through the old shapes. Brother. Same. See? I tell him I am ready. I tell him the watch is ending. And I hope, with the last spark of my imagination, that somewhere in the deep timber, he is sitting on a log, feeling the vibration of my goodbye, and waiting to welcome me home.